The Butterfly's Dream by Curvers 314, Chapter 17, Footnote. Hello, Ruby. It was her. No amount of fallible memories could deny her presence. His other was not a vain person, hardly ever using that full-length mirror in her room, yet he knew her face the way one knew one's own, with a vagueness and bias that made it less and more than the way it was to everyone else. This was reality, but it was not real. It was hard, but he would have to keep that in mind during this far-fetched scenario. No matter how much he wanted to reach out and touch her, the pseudo-girl would be more likely to take his hand and then shake it. No life in those ghostly hands, no empathy in those silver eyes glazed with an ancient patina. Did he really expect anything more from a product of an enemy incantation? The memory of his clone traveling faster than the speed of light had hit him with an image of her likeness, and that was all that counted. The fact that she had unhesitantly cut down his copy mattered not. He only knew he had to see her. And now, here you are, he marveled as she just kept staring at him. At least she wasn't attacking him yet, though. Why was that? Yet another mystery to chalk up to the absurdity which life handed them. Your name's Ruby Rose. At least he thought it was. It was her face, but his clothes and his weapons. Whose body would it be underneath? He didn't care to speculate. Her silence left enough to the imagination. You do know that, don't you? She continued to play dumb and stiff as a scarecrow, which was a far cry from the memory his clone had presented, where her natural speed was on dazzling display for those entire 16 milliseconds. What are you even doing here? He coughed, shaking his head with incredulity. You're checking up on your dumb Oni-san to make sure he hasn't gotten himself into trouble? The term felt stiff as the rest of the sentence. They had tried all manner of endearment to one another. In one breath he was her older brother, and in some ways the younger. In another they were a long-distance couple who refused to know that it wouldn't work out. They were one and the same, but also so much more than any words could describe. That was also why his dialogue had felt so stale. He was trying to fill a space where nothing belonged, hoping to incite some kind of reaction, preferably non-violent. Holding still's not going to make the moment last longer, you know, he offered with a lopsided smile. I'm going to have to go back soon. Either way, you can't stick around. It felt awful saying something like that, but he just had to keep reminding himself that this was not her. She was still lurking somewhere between his pupils and his conscience, wasn't she? Come on. Out of 5 of them, you chose to come out, right? Why? Give me something to work with? Though he would not depend on her, it had taken him a lot longer to reach her than his memories did to reach him. Then during that travel, he'd been preparing a contingency just in case this construct would prove as hostile as the rest, because he knew that once he laid eyes on her, he wouldn't be able to think up a reasonable strategy. He'd always taken it for granted that she was watching, and it was a distraction. Now, as he actively probed his mind for her aura, which he'd never identified because he'd never been without, like so many things that he'd come to experience. It was difficult to know everything that was going on in that moment, and so easy to let what was happening pass him by. He managed to catch on to the projectile weapons hurled at him with enough time, however. So, that's the way it's going to be, huh? With partial regret and partial excitement for what was about to occur, he leapt backwards away from the salvo, which quickly expanded into a storm of kunai, blotting out the sun on that otherwise cloudless day. It was a simple matter of to flicker away from impending doom and let the legions of metal rain down on the helpless foliage. It was so simple that he expected her to be waiting for him as his muscles went back to solid state. They overshot one another in the middle of the clearing and exchanged blows from their kuzurigama, the metal-on-metal contact ringing like the wind chimes hanging from the overhang outside the cabin in Patch. The difference between their heights was negligible, and so Naruto held no advantage in reach, but neither did he have to worry about the over-engineered weapon making his own superfluous. superfluous. It would come down to their individual skills with the undammered Kusurigama, and the ruby's likeness was not inhabited by the subsidies of the smaller blade, like a baby bird which fell from its nest. When a weapon was put in her hand, she learned to fly. Blades coupled, they each yanked towards one another, bringing themselves in for a quick exchange of fists. Naruto's right cross was batted away by Ruby's elbow in the first deviation from mirrored strikes. The kick which she shot at his stomach he tried to latch on to before it was revealed to be a feint, at the same time revealing that it was her lithe body underneath the baggy pants and jacket when her leg flowed dexterously upwards into his head. He ducked and parried with his weapon, carving a wide circle with both sides, hooked to the other and disengaging halfway. He spun around with his own kick, heel driving into a reinforced blow sandwiched between her elbow and knee. But just like with her attack, his leg drew back quickly, coiling into his stomach and shifting his momentum for a downward slash. A resounding clang as the shaft crossed once again, skittering and sliding with a harsh skittish strike as the hooked blade drew back and tried to wrench the smaller opponent's weapon away. She gave freely, did not resist with that abnormal strength imbued to the unspeaking golem, which kept pacing with his own. Backing off a few paces, two kunai flew from her hand at near point blank range. It was a simple block for the half of his kusarigama as he drew it across his body, chain wrapping out after it and slicing the air with its head counterweight. The replica ducked carelessly, and even when he changed the serpent path, with the pulse of his chakra, she was not fooled and danced around its new course like water. Her own chain dragged a deep gauge in the earth as she brought it with a vertical swipe just from the dry landscape, filled the air and blocked his view, and he went on the defensive with the metal stand encircling around him like a cyclone, eyes darting back and forth amidst the fog of war, wary of any attack from any angle, movement from the right, and he shot out at it. But it was a distraction, the tip of her chain teasing him as she flew underneath the cloud of dust with a shocking swipe meant to harvest his legs. He was supposed to jump, but he didn't. Having only just managed to produce a Rasengan with one hand, he twisted his body around with almost as much flexibility as his counterpart and drove it into the ground in front of her. Now it was his turn to disappear into the dust and debris, waiting, lurking, a shadow walking across his field of vision, coming and going in and out of extinction. He didn't hesitate and pounced, flick off the wrist, the scythe brought around overhead, another block, another shift, riposte, hasty defense, counterattack, repeat, repeat. Naruto landed heavily on the chewed up grass, wiping a bit of sweat which escaped from underneath his headband. Ruby had yet to show any signs of fatigue. I gotta say, that's one impressive seal. He applauded whoever designed the ray for making the Guardians so close in power to the original. In a way, it made him more excited knowing of such a manipulation of time and space. It was clear to him by now that while she might have some of Ruby's features, he was fighting something that had parts of both. There was no other way it would last that long otherwise. Something else was giving it chakra and strength. Was that his own or something borrowed as well? It was poor timing, but he hoped that Ruby really was this capable. It would allow him to sleep better at night. Granted, he was only trying to keep her alive. The durability was supposed to be that of a clone, and he was sure that an overzealous strike would dispel her and negate what he was trying to do, though nothing thrown at her had done so thus far, and he was a little wary of what that implied. Still, he had yet to scrape the surface of his bag of tricks. He had given up one, and was waiting for reciprocating. If she could use her semblance as well as ninjutsu, that would change things. It was tempting to drag things out and try to coax it out of her, see the legendary ability too, with his own eyes, but he was running out of time for such indulgence. She was in no hurry, however. patiently waiting for him to catch his breath and devise a better strategy, almost like there was a living part of the creature which wanted him to succeed. He would do his best to oblige, his body blurred under the blank scrutiny of the guardian construct, being unsurprised when it re-materialized behind her, but the buzzing whoosh of movement had betrayed the action far ahead of time, casually running the scythe along the length of her back and blocking the attack, which was too obvious for the one who was familiar with the movements. All too obvious. Another Naruto, more likely the real one, reappeared in front of her, flinging the chain to loop around her waist. The feint was simple, and it wasn't unexpected. Ruby might have anticipated it. With an almost bored expression, she greeted the other three linked metal strands, not even bothering to struggle as they encircled her wrists and ankles. She was just that much slower, not even talking about the real Ruby speed. This body which fought him was as confused as he was, not quite used to either the power nor the sensation of battling in his world. The Kusarigama just that much different dynamic to make it a strange rather than familiar weight. It was hesitating. It was hesitating. He had realized this, which was also how he realized she would not be as fast as him on the replacement technique, allowing him those crucial few hairbreadths to set up his clones at the peripheries of the battlefield. What to do now? He had entrapped her, but his intention was not to dispel her, if he could indeed bring himself to strike her image down so casually. At the beginning of the match, he had not given this question much thought, only planning so far ahead to restrain her. There was a crazy idea jumping at the bite which offered a solution. It was a long shot, but he didn't have much of a choice. Also, not much to lose. The basics of sealing were all he had time for in the waning weeks of his training journey. Disappointed at not learning how to forge his own explosive notes, now he had to begrudgingly admit that perhaps the old pervert was right in having him learn the rudimentary storage seal first off, and not only because he probably would have blown himself up. Seal! A bit overzealous when cutting his fingers, the bloody swipe streaked wide across the scroll and spattered upon the unfeeling face of his adversary, painting her deathly lips the color they should have been. The stark contrast polarizing ashen skin, and for a moment she appeared to glow. He thought he caught a flash of cognition behind that stolen gaze, life or something else, or something close to it. As well the idea perhaps that she had allowed him to capture her, but it was too quickly lost in the smoke. The chains fell slack and he dropped to a knee, balancing the open scroll upon it with the still liquid kanji struggling to coagulate in the middle. The crimson letters solidified and appeared to pulsate once before turning dull black with the rest. He released a pent-up breath along with his control. His copies disappeared with three small pops, barely heard above the sound of rustling paper and his own beating heart. He tucked the full scroll into the first of many such special pouches he had sewn into his jacket for just such a purpose. That weight now secure with a quick loop tie, he allowed himself to finally relax, only to then remember that he did not have that luxury. Damn! How much time had he expended? The fight felt quick, but with his skewed sense of time, it could have been the entire day gone by. The sun was still high, and in his estimation, had not shifted by much, though as he was looking at it with a hand shaded against his brow, a dark spot floated across his vision. Squinting blue eyes picked out what looked like a bird silhouette against the sun, not something out of the ordinary. It just so happened that this avian seemed to have a passenger and baggage. What was the name of that Akatsuki member? Daniel, Dada, Didi? He wished once again that he had Ruby to remind him of the briefing in which so many names and rap sheets had passed by like movie frames, but it hardly mattered anyway, as he caught a shock of red hair in the claws of the buzzard, which had just then conveniently angled towards him. Fate, they said, was blind, that is, if he were to believe in such a thing. The chain coiled in his hands gave off a low, undulating whistle as he twirled it like a bolo, judging the heft and wondering if he could make it that far with any accuracy. He'd not had much practice with an airborne target. Would the criminal not notice him? Was there not the potential to hit Gara by mistake? Even a small mistake on his part could send the weapon astray, let alone have the man change his fortuitous flight plan just 1 degree. Now wasn't the time to doubt himself. The low whistle became a piercing shriek as the chained weapon hurled upwards at the airborne target. The fate that he did not believe in would also have the blonde bomber distracted at just that time, glancing up backwards to see if his pursuers had caught up with him. What the? He heard the outraged cry as the clay bird dropped out of the sky like a rock, like it ought to have, if not brought to life by the man's jutsu. Naruto, Naruto was already bounding through the sparse trees, having set his own course and intercepted the wrapped up the package before it landed. He would not rescue his friend only to have him die from the fall. Deidara, though in his mind he would still feel as if Dada was somehow right, saw his approach this time, and even as he fell, unleashed the remains of his flock upon the blonde Jinchuriki. The explosions went off like firecrackers as the hummingbird-sized bombs dived after him, but they were just the clay imitations of the real thing, and he had already proven to be faster than a copy that day. He flashed in quick succession before any of them could land so much as a spark on the orange scarf trailing over his shoulder. In between his rapidly vibrating atoms, he could see the gnashing scowl of his equally blond adversary, who had no other means to stop his spamming of the body flicker technique. It was inevitable that he would reach the body of his companion, still firmly held in the clutches of that overgrown modern statue. Deidara was not about to let him get away with his costly prize, but would have no say in the matter as Naruto kicked the hog-tied bird sculpture of the artist. The sculpture presented enough distraction for the bomber and enough mass for Naruto to kick himself and his friend away from the foiled criminal, the man cursing up a storm as he rummaged around in his pockets for more explosives. The man could send squadrons of bombs his way, but Naruto would just outrun them now that he had his friend back in his arms. He had a keen sense of priorities and held no delusions that he could best the S-rank ninja on his own. The rest of his team had likely already run him ragged, yet as even now they popped up in the peripheries of his senses, close on the heels of their prey, three allies speeding their way towards the landing site. Backup had arrived. Now all he had to do was land safely on them. He dropped the limp body as if it had burned him, which was not far from the truth, as the next instant Gara ballooned outwards and exploded in a cacophony of noise and a nova of light. Toes touching down on the ground again, he looked at a familiar knee and breathed a sigh of relief as he patted himself down, searching for smoldering patches of clothes and checking to make sure all his digits were still attached, his hand wandering over the lump in his jacket. He hated to associate the feeling of precognition in with deja vu because he honestly hadn't known it was coming. It was more along the lines of a gut feeling, though even that did not do it justice. Regardless, he did not have time to sit and ponder the unknown feeling as he had to relocate the bomber and track down the real body of his friend. Naruto! Tamari's familiar face was the first one to meet him from out of the abuse and charred foliage. Are you all right? Fine, he said assuredly, standing up to his full height, which was just about even to the Kunoichi. What about you and the others? How many are with you? We're fine, thanks. The answer came before the man known as Sharingan no Kakashi appeared hot on her heels. Tenten managed to snag Deidara with a kunai laced with dye, which we could track, so we pursued him, hoping that you'd be able to follow our trail. The man smiled behind his mask, Naruto only now getting used to the strange manner in which the cloth went taut in the cheeks and his eyes scrunched up in a U. It seems like you caught up as well. Seems so, Naruto replied with his own uncovered smile. Oi, quit lagging, a rough voice Naruto didn't recognize called from the trees. There was a rustle, and a small pug wearing a striped dog Konohashi uniform lined on a branch. I'm the one with short legs here, Kakashi. You shouldn't call me out just to make me wait. Sorry, Pakan. The silver-haired man apologized, the three quickly regaining their pace and taking to the trees now that they had rounded up their last member. Nice to meet you, Pakan-san. The ninja dog looked back mid-leap at the strangely grinning blonde and gave him a curt nod. There will be time for introductions later. The droning came up from behind them as they sped after the dog's nose. We don't know how soon we managed to interrupt them in the ceiling. It's possible that Gaara might still be alive. As the elder and more experienced shinobi, it was not Kakashi's job to baby them with assurances that everything was going to be alright. All he needed to do was provide a bit of hope, and he knew Naruto would take care of the rest. Right? The blonde teen face hardened, and so did his eyes as they pierced through the treetops and spied a sand-colored patch against the blue sky. Is that them? He asked of the pug, getting a patient grunt in response. Where's your Kusarigama? Tamari asked in sudden concern, delaying him. Don't need it. She readied her fan in support, already knowing he was about to do something rash. After all, it's just a weapon. It wasn't just leaves that were picked up this time by his rapid movement. Splinters were where his feet dug into the thick branches, and a resounding smell of ozone flew into their faces as he disappeared. Oh, so you survived after all? Their target spoke casually, glancing above and behind him from his one eye poking out behind his blonde ponytail. I suppose you didn't like my replica, no? Well, I can't blame you. Art is fleeting, ephemeral, and unpredictable. His fellow blonde ignored him as he fell like an arrow straight at him and his bride. In fact, one might say, simply reaching into his satchel and tensing as the boy drew ever nearer. That art is an explosion! Laughing manically at once again getting the chance to deliver his line to a fresh audience. Nonetheless, his cackling was drawn out by the consecutive blast which lit up the sky, eliciting the daylight. He had saved those especially for the other Jinchuriki, kept them in reserve until the foolish brat decided to show his face. They were coated in a special powder in which a 1-2 punch dispersed it and the sound charge ignited, creating a powerful and consecutive and concussive airburst which would be guaranteed to knock any one of his tails. Even though they were not designed to kill, they would certainly send even the stubbornest combatants for a loop, and he had covered the skyline with them. There would be so many for the teen and his valiant teenager to flash out in time. So then, why did his kidney feel like it was about to explode? How did you escape my How'd you escape my panorama? You're right, that beauty is fleeting. No answer, only another anvil-like blow came to his shoulder, and he could hear the sound of his collar bone snapping, and there is no substitute for the real thing. His leg buckled as the heel drove itself into the back of his knee. Theodora could imagine the look of the blonde from his voice alone, deducting that somehow that boy had made it out without a wound, but not unscathed. And yes, Theodora recognizes the pained sound of someone who had lost. It was such a common response in all his audience, and it often offered a sliver of confidence as his inspiring ending loomed near. But you know what? The voice whispered to him, and he could smell the sweaty breath, heavy with his own sulfur, tickle his ears. Sometimes a copy can do some good, sometimes pretending is good enough. The knuckles driving into his temple was debating, but to a man who had stifled himself and his desires for years, while being lashed down to mundanity by his village, it was a trifle pain. Don't think you're so hot, huh? Naruto was gone as soon as the Akatsuki swept his legs underneath him, disappearing into thin air. You shouldn't try to pass yourself off as something greater, kid. Deidara reached behind him, his head to catch the attack's wrist, twisting the kunai out of its grip and shoving his mouth palm into the boy's gut. Baku! The blast radiated outward, focused by the chakra in his hands and consuming the blonde ones again in a fiery inferno. There was no way the Jinchuriki could have escaped that, but until he saw the charred corpse, Deidara wasn't letting his guard down, though he was not expecting a dragon made of flame to come biting back at him through the cloud of smoke. He cursed and leapt up and away from the beast, landing on his mount as it flew upwards to greet him. But the infernal dragon was not on his tail about not a turnabout. By now he was running short of explosives, but he could afford to spend a small one in. And he spent at least a small one on this, letting the dragon chomp down on a wad of his C1 attack and detonate from the inside. Bunch of amateurs. Then how about something original? The copies of Naruto which he'd only now noticed helped explain how the boy had dodged his attacks twice, but even as he was about to decry the unoriginality of the clones, they collapsed midair and transferred into a puff of smoke. What came out was pure art. If you were into that gothic masquerade scene, a creature as black as midnight shrieked once again, dispelling the smoke with one bat of its massive wings as it dove straight as a bullet. It was so fast, so enthralling that he didn't even try to fly out of it on on, fly out of it unstoppable trajectory. The bone white mask carving through the belly of his bird like it was little more than paper mache. It snatched the red head up with surprising delicacy before hurling the unconscious Kasukage down towards the ground. Deidara himself missing the boy's fate as he was thrown clear of the squeaking, warbling massacre moments before it combusted. There, though he was not let alone, even after losing his prize, as before he could land he was carried upwards again by the vindictive wind, spared from the ground, but not from the demise as the demon bird emerged seemingly unscathed from the dispatching cloud. What couldst you tragedy tricks won't work twice? He would be more than ready to by the time the snapping jaws of the ravenesque creature snapped at him, throwing a baseball-sized wad of clay into the air and trading places with it, letting the bird brain chomp down on it much as the dragon had, except there was something else of this alien and intelligence that was not there within the jutsu, and as a result, it batted the ball of explosives away before riding the thermal updraft back to Deidara. For this unexpected maneuver, the razor-sharp beak of the predator got in unformationable and uncomfortable. Uh, Predator got uncomfortably close before he managed another short-range concussive, which nailed it square in the chest, knocking it back towards the ground with a breathless keening, only for it to break apart like a piñata, spilling Naruto's clones every which way. Most were still headed towards the ground, but from the tree line emerged the magic carpet, piloted by a sandy blonde, to whisk one of them away, the rest pairing up with one abyss transforming into a giant shuriken, which was then hurled at Deidara as he silently applauded the seamless transition. As the blonde bomb dodged with relative ease, Naruto and Tamara confessed whilst adrift on their fan. "Can you give me a boost?" It was a request more than an actual question, but it was still good to ask. Could she do so and still maintain her fighting? Or would she have to sacrifice her airborne position to get Naruto close in for the kill? Either way, it was going to work. She had her brother back, safe in the arms of Kakashi, waiting for the two of them far below. She would be her best to indulge this faith in her. It was only fair that she try. Make it count. They both leapt off the massive battle fan with their own direction, Temari kicking the sturdy metal into her hand, and Naruto focusing his energies into the palm of his hand. They were not that high up, but it would still hurt massively, so she would only have a small window to catch herself after she settled him on his wound. Wait, Naruto, she was sure he'd be just fine, whispering the name of her attack like a prayer, and inverting her usual routine of focusing all of her chakra to a fine point. She heaved a dispersed gust underneath Naruto's descending form, making him shoot off like a rocket, straining at Deidara, who was still preoccupied with the clones, and shunting her off in the opposite direction towards the ground. They were only seconds before she hit the trees, but before deigning to catch herself, she twisted upwards to watch the finale. The blue, almost white, spinning orb in Naruto's hand, catching the sun and looming almost like the North Star as it plowed into a staggered Akatsuki, a blue star from which all wanderers found their way home. The weightlessness without purpose or direction, deafness, not even an echo, blankness without beginning or end. Was this what dreaming was like, or was this death? What was the difference anyway? Was sleep not just that little death before the long rest, or was the eternity after life merely the beginning of a greater awakening? To sleep, to sleep and perchance to dream, but what dreams may come to those who slumber. For him there was nothing, no fanfares awaited, no loved ones to the gates of a pure and perfect world. It was a dismissal experience. It was a dismal experience. But then he was too tired anyway, that it didn't matter. He was afraid, but would meet that cold embrace like an old friend. Friends, he could always hear their calling him for the first time. A life like his own, which was so close to ending. He knew them, didn't he? Though never spoke a word, or shared a view, or felt the sympathetic vibrations of the heartstrings, he knew. Hey there! Words like an arm reached out to pluck him from the fathomless pool towards the surface, but away from the distorted reflection. He let it, for he knew this voice too. Naruto, is that you? He didn't expect he'd be so lucky, but what did it hurt to hope? It's nice of you to remember after all this time. How could he forget? The memory of his light illuminated him through the depths of his past. Are you dead too? A chuckle and the tinkling of bells. Not quite yet, neither of us. Not for a while, I hope. But how? His voice was dry and cracked. Someone pressed the lip of a bottle against his lips and trickled the water down his throat. But how? He repeated the question, this time wondering why his omnipresent shield of sand did not block the gentle touch. Surely that meant he was dead. I I remember the Akatsuki. That one Deidara attacked the village. We fought. He won, didn't he? So then, if he had indeed not perished, then everything he knew about life had been wrong. It's over now, the familiar voice reassured. It was all just a bad dream. Just go back to sleep, and when you wake, everything will be all right. The request was sweet solace to ears which had heard too much. Nonetheless, fear erupted in his heart, where before there hadn't been anything, even when staring his own mortality in the face. Sleep? I can't sleep. If I sleep, the demon will gain control, and no one will be safe. Heart racing and letting him know that he was still alive only served to increase the impending panic. I won't let him. The arms holding him tightened, reining in his rampant emotions. Rest now, and when you wake again, I'll be here. Is that a promise? Even if this was just a dream, in the loftiest of wishes, he could never desire a better one. You'll be there when I awake. And Tamare and Kankuro, of course, they're here too, and more. We're all here for you, Gara. I swear to you. You will wait for me. His lidded body rocketed as he was gently lowered to the ground. Away from that thing keeping him afloat, he tried desperately to reach out and recapture his hold on reality, but all he managed to do was wiggle his fingers, which raked through a different kind of sea, sand, his home, even though he missed the radiating warmth from the body pressed up against him. The heat still trapped in the earth throughout the day was almost as inviting. And when he became aware of that, he noticed the other traces of the desert, smelled the tang of salt and earth, listened as a sirocco played music over the glassy dunes, which was a lullaby to his heart, to his head, as well as his heart. I will sleep as well, next to you, so that when you wake, I will be right here, waiting for you. Thank you, Naruto. Sleep well, my friend. It was hard waking up, going to bed right after dinner, and sleeping until the alarm went off at 7:30. It somehow felt like she had been asleep for days. At the same time, when she had finally thrown back the covers and lifted herself out of bed, like a cat-like stretch to the ceiling, the desire of sleep was banished and she was brimming with motivation to start the day. She shifted her legs over the edge and let herself drop to the ground. It was longer than expected, and only when her gut threatened to jump out of her throat did she remember their new sleeping arrangement. She managed to organize her legs underneath her, landing slightly on all fours. A glance around the room showed her that the rest of her team had come back sometime during the night after she had gone to bed. Good. That was a welcome sign that their burgeoning relationship were not as bad as she'd gone to sleep surmising. She thought herself silly for ever having painted the things to be so gloomy. Whatever part of her that had been felt like that was also exist during the night. A little bit of her fears bottled up and shipped away on the outgoing tide. The sun always rose, snows always melted, and things always got better. Proving once again of these unquestionable truisms, she set about making sure her body was as ready as her mind to commence the day's activities. First, breakfast. Today would be better. That was at least what Yang thought. They were eating together, if that was any indication, and their family. One could sit through dinner with a scowl or a pout, pushing peas around the plate with a fork and a stare burning enough to caramelize onions. It didn't matter, because as long as everyone was at the table things could be resolved. It was only when someone was absent that something was truly wrong and nothing could be fixed. She could count the number of those occasions on one hand and still have a thumb left over. Half of those times had been after Ruby had been sent away. Shaking the memory away all too easily, Yang gave a cautious smile to the group at large. Quite though they might have been, but a good deal better than open hostility. What's got into you? Nothing. The soft smile which had creeped Weiss out turned into one of knowledge as she swept back to the half-eaten quiche on her plate. The heiress to the Schnee family fortune, however, uh, Fortune hovered her skeptical gaze over the blonde for another moment longer before turning back to her leader and partner. Yang's attitude was strange, but it was Ruby who had been the sole focus of her scrutiny for the past 24 hours. Giggling as she took another almost ironic bite of her ice cream sundae, was this really Signal's best and brightest? Professor Port had let that fact slip during his dismissal of her complaints, and though her ego still reeled at the insults leveled at her, there was a certain amount of truth that she couldn't deny. There was little chance that the seemingly immature girl was accepted on a fluke. It made sense that she would have had prior records to show her accomplished status, and yet something just didn't add up. Weiss was still waiting for the hard copies of Signal records to be scrounged up from her father's sources. It would be far easier to simply take the teacher's words for it, play along with the rationale. Although how could she? Ruby's social awkwardness and strange persona painted an incomplete picture, especially hanging next to the pinnacle of achievement and dignity which was Pyra Nikos. Now who's staring? Am not, she denied fervently, shoving her face back into her salad and stabbing a cherry tomato meaningly. Just because Weiss had not taken advantage of her distraction did not mean that Yang was going to give the same courtesy. She was about to prod the bejesus out of the stuck-up girl who could really stand to be taken down a peg or four, when a sharp intake of breath drew the collective attention to the head of the table. What? What's the matter, Ruby? Yang was immediately on her feet, ready to rally to the defense of her sister, but the youngest attention was fixed at the entrance. It did not register her sister's call. Suddenly a dust devil kicked up at the table, sending utensils and scraps of food flying in all directions as their leader disappeared. Yang could only blink after the storm had passed and search frantically to where her sister had darted off to. Ruby! Velvet! Like a game of Marco Polo, without a blindfold she found her target all too easily, and with that same childhood nostalgia came the sight of her sibling latched around a familiar face. A plain one, if not for the bowed rabbit's ears perched on her head, and an expression that looked like she wanted to drop what she was doing and crawl into the safety of the ground, Ruby and all. Hey there, Pipsqueak! Another familiar face, though it would be more correct to say a familiar smirk, which was the only thing recognizable underneath a new pair of designer sunglasses and a constantly changing wardrobe. The rabbit girl's expression shifted as her own recollections surmounted shyness. She dropped the thankful empty lunch tray and returned the enthusiastic embrace with almost as much gusto, nuzzling the head which was already buried in her chest. Ruby, it's so good to see you. What are you doing here? As the sight of her sister was partially swallowed up by the behemoth and the ruddy-skinned boy who entered with the two women, the various onlookers turned their attention back to their own conversations and business. Out of sight, out of mind, Yang too relaxed, but kept an ear out across the noisy lunch-room. She would say hello as well in due course, but let her sister relish the special bond she shared with the two older women, not much caring as long as no one was in danger. And with her tuna fish sandwich finished off by the gale, Blake went back to her book, or so it seemed to everyone else who was watching her face, and not her bow which twitched in the direction of her captain and the new faunus. A smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Weiss was in a way comforted seeing Weiss was in a way comforted seeing her partner in the presence of upper classmates. The tidbit she deduced from the fact that she had not seen them during the entrance exam. She would find the greeting a little undignified and off-putting, and yet at the same time there was a pang of jealousy she could not deny, which her own sister would be as understanding. Not that she'd ever admit it out loud either. Yes, that day would indeed be better. Naruto, it was hard to tell with that greeting if the woman was overjoyed or annoyed to see him. He was banking on the latter being due solely to the mountain of paperwork on her desk. He would hope anyway. What can I do for you today? You wouldn't be taking any more missions right away after returning from Suna. That was probably wise. He was tired himself from the emotional roller coaster he'd been through and the almost literal race they'd had there and back. I don't need to tie you to your bed to make sure you get some rest, do I? This time he knew the dangerous twitch in her eye was all for him. Or no, that's all right, Bak Hokage-sama. Her eyes were appraising now. None of that previous danger or lethargy remained. Sharp, becoming a leader. Speak then. She did her best to sound professional, not missing the affectionate slip, but making an effort not to sound disappointed or worry for what was sure to be another long day and additional tonnage stacked on her desk. Actually, I sort of wanted to talk about the mission, well, more about the Akatsuki. Her chocolate eyes blinked, the only signal that she'd heard what he'd said, and eventually he took that as permission to continue. We know that they're collecting Biju. That much was almost common knowledge now, along with the fact that the organization contains some of the most hardened criminals in the shinobi world, though we still don't know for what. Another blink. So what? Naruto heaved a heavy sigh, wondering not for the first time how he sounded to others. He no longer had someone to bounce things off of, and there were still reservations about what he nonetheless knew he had to do. For now, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. I mean, it does in the long run, but not for me or the others. Gaara, we got lucky with him, but we can't exactly rely on the other villages having someone like Chayobaya-sama who can bring them back to life after the extraction. The village elder had given her life in an even exchange for Gaara's, and he would never forget that. We have to protect them, make sure that Koski don't get their hands on them. He would try to avoid someone having to do it again, if at all possible. The other hidden villages have already been put on alert and are doing whatever they deem prudent to protect the Jinchuriki. She tapped her finger against the desk impatiently, already sensing the boy's emotional investment. And we have a tactical agreement to share information on the Akatsuki whenever it pops up. I admit it's not ideal, but you can't just erase generations of animosity between villages with the snap of a finger. Not like you could erase a lifetime of memories for a single person. I know what you're thinking, though. He might have laughed if the situation were not so dismal, and I'm not going to let one of my shinobi go traipsing off across the countryside to fraternize with other villages ninja on my dime, let alone one of the very people that Katsuki are looking for. She rested her head on her fist, staring at him with a look he found to be contemptuous. Think, Naruto, you're not stupid. What would you do anyway? You may be a Chunin, possibly even a Jonin, if push comes to shove, but all of their members are S-ranked and travel in pairs. There is also no way I could spare anyone else to babysit you either. If I had my way, I would put you as far away as possible from their reach, the moon if necessary, not bunch you all up in a single spot so they could harvest you like a suckling pig. He took it all with a mute grace that was unbecoming to all who knew him. It was not like he hadn't expected this, hadn't known what to say to it, and either had he had hoped that being confronted with it in the moment something might come to mind. Does that mean we can't try? He asked sincerely. The woman sighed, showing her years behind that mask of youth. What would you have me do, Naruto? Not only are you important to this village, but I kind of like you too. But that doesn't mean I can forget about my other obligations. When I took this position, I agreed to be the Hokage first, and everything else a distant second, including Tsunade Senju. Would you have me grovel to the other Kage to allow us to manage their tailed beast for them? Do you not understand how naive and pathetic that would make me appear? She had not been flattering when she said she was not dumb. He was in fact rather bright, else he would not be at the rank he was, or have survived nearly as long. But sometimes she wondered with social matters if he just chose to ignore them, or if somehow he didn't quite see the way everyone else saw. Who knows? Maybe that was the mark of a true genius. They aren't just held beasts. He tried to keep his cool all throughout the verbal redress, but to have the distinction between container and beast dismissed, he could not help an angry spark shoot down his arm and clench his fist. They're human beings. You're right. Tsunade stapled her hands and stared at Naruto past them. They're only humans, just like all of them. She jerked her finger to the open window, passed it over the throngs of people who looked more like ants from this height. It would make them no easier to crush. Most of them were civilians, plebeians who would never be famous, never accomplish anything memorable, and never amount to much, even with hordes of them backing a single goal. From this perspective, they were just numbers like everyone else. Even the shinobi were expendable. Like him, Konoha had invested a lot in his training and protection, but that would just make it slightly more difficult to replace them. The same went for the other containers, all the way up to the Kage. People were measured by usefulness, not by how many they were mourned. But he couldn't think like that. Each of those lives might be another like his, like Ruby's. The other side of the glass was the same distance away as that untouchable and undefiable mirror which played out his alternate life. Each of those people might as well have been him, and he could not rate the lives of kindred spirits above the rest. Friends were just people one had not met yet. Do you understand now? She had already crossed the desk and lay a hand on his shoulder, less with a leader and more like a mother, a leader of a different kind. I have to make decisions which will protect as many people as I can. Sometimes they are hard, but I cannot afford to have a bias. Is this not the way things should be done? Was it? Where had such attitude gotten them? Sometimes it was okay to settle, yet why do so when the truth was right in front of you and so much more beautiful than the compromise could ever be? Perhaps they had simply told themselves for so long that this was the best way, that now all believed in that delusion, ignoring the miracles which happened if one only looked. I do. he allowed that righteous anger to bleed away. You must do what you feel is right, and he would do likewise. He had conceded to her, which was all that was supposed to matter, but there was also his wording, and the way his eyes never ceased to dance with a hidden flame, which even the deluge she'd hoped upon him failed to extinguish. She dismissed him all the same, sent him off to rest and recuperate, but more likely to scheme and study and train himself into the ground like she'd seen him do that time so long ago. Maybe it was that memory which made her ignore the anxiousness which came with his parting words. She should have continued to be the village leader, threatened him with the consequences of what she knew he was planning. Yet even her eyes, jaded through years and hardships, still sought out the divine light which shone in his wake. Was it too much for an old woman to dream of a better day? To the moon, huh? Far, far away, where no one would ever find them. It was just that simple, just that difficult, some might say impossible. That was becoming his specialty. But how far, how fast would an arrow need fly to reach that pale sphere? It was just a distance, after all. He would bury himself in study to cross that infinite expanse. Anything less than that would be child's play. At least he had all the tools to accomplish this. Fuinjutsu scrolls in one hand, there was a photograph in his other, something Jiraiya would give to him all too willingly, with a lecherous wing attached. A line or two would accompany it, but that was all. A blonde woman with a stature which would hearken of Pyronikos, and a bearing which would remind him of Blake. All that gathered from a picture of her twisted halfway looking over her shoulder with a feral glint in her eyes, and sniffing out the photograph with a sharp and unforgivable keen. He would read the lines, commit them to memory along with the image. Number 2, Ni Jujito. He would not let another one of them perish. End of chapter 17.